welcome to this explainer. Look, today we're jumping straight into the dark, true story of a man whose very name is literally synonymous with the macabre, Edgar Allan Poe. We're going to trace his incredibly traumatic life, and by the end, you'll see exactly how a life constantly chased by profound tragedy ended up birthing the modern horror genre as we know it today. So let's just get right into it. Lord, help my poor soul. These were the final whimpered words of Edgar Allan Poe. And to really grasp the sheer weight of that desperate plea, we have to understand the tragedy of a man whose entire existence felt like it was being actively hunted by death. For Poe, death wasn't just some shadow following him around. It was the only companion who never actually abandoned him. Let's start at the beginning, Section 1, A Life Born in Shadows, and the First Strike of the Red Death. In the bitter winter of 1809, a boy named Edgar was born in Boston to failing actors. Right from the start, his life was defined far more by shadows than by any light. By the time he was just 1 year old, his father had entirely abandoned the family. And then, at age 3, his mother succumbed to tuberculosis. This was the devastating very first appearance of the Red Death in his life, a horrific disease that would relentlessly haunt him for the rest of his days. For this young boy, love was already a luxury he simply couldn't afford. This brutal start forces a massive change, bringing us to Section 2, The Conditional Son, and John Allan's world. So the orphaned boy gets shipped off to Richmond, Virginia, to live with John Allan, a wealthy tobacco merchant. But here's the thing. Allan didn't view Poe as a son to be loved. He viewed him strictly as a conditional investment, something meant to eventually pay off in the business world. Poe was actually never legally adopted. For him, the middle name Allan was merely an expensive suit he was permitted to wear, a constant looming reminder that his place in the family was entirely conditional. And the contrast here is staggering. While Allan is obsessing over his ledgers and profits, young Poe is retreating inward, devouring classic literature and scribbling these bleeding verses about a dark atmospheric world. Unsurprisingly, this transactional relationship just couldn't last. Allan eventually sent Poe off to the University of Virginia, but he actively set him up for failure by providing less than a third of the funds Poe actually needed to survive. Desperate to pay for his education, Poe turned to gambling. And, of course, the house always wins, right? When Poe returned home completely broke, John Allan coldly labeled him useless. This was the final fracture. Poe was totally done with Allan's toxic brand of parenting. Desperate for his own place in the world, he ran away. Which leads us to Section 3, the search for structure. He did what a lot of young men running from a toxic home do. He joined the military. He enlisted in the United States Army under the fake name Edgar A. Perry, claiming to be older than he actually was. And ironically enough, he excelled. He moved rapidly up the ranks in less than 2 years. The military gave him a structure he had literally never known. But while he was good at it, that rigid structure just couldn't satisfy his profound, burning inner passion for poetry. He needed to write. It was the only thing that made him feel alive. But just as he was starting to figure out his path, the relentless stalker returned. Tuberculosis struck again. In 1829, it took Miss Allan, his foster mother, who was the absolute only warm presence in the Allan household. And shortly after, in 1831, the Red Death claimed his biological brother, a man who shared Poe's scarred, orphaned history. It was just this agonizing, painful reminder of how fragile life really was, and how death always seemed to be waiting right around the corner. Beaten down by loss and rejection, Poe finally moved to Baltimore. Let's look at Section 4, Finding the Anchor. What's really fascinating about Poe's new environment is how profoundly it changed literature forever. He moved into a cramped, poor, but deeply affectionate household in Baltimore with his Aunt Maria Clem. Finally surrounded by some actual warmth, he felt free to delve deep into his own scarred mind. Look, at this time in the 1800s, standard American literature was all about sunny landscapes and noble heroes. Well, Poe absolutely shattered that. He swapped those sunlit fields for psychological horror, guilt, obsession, madness, and rot. He wasn't writing about monsters hiding in the woods. He was writing about the terrifying depths of the human psyche. Now, the warmth in that Baltimore home came primarily from Maria's daughter, Virginia. Poe married her when she was just 13. And while that definitely raises eyebrows today, to Poe, she was his absolute anchor and his muse. She was this beacon of blissful ignorance in a world that had only ever given him cold hands. Her innocent joy literally kept his brilliant but dark mind from spiraling totally into the abyss. With her, he found the closest thing to happiness he had ever known. But in Poe's world, joy was never, ever allowed to last. This brings us to a devastating turning point, Section 5, the arrival of Nevermore. It happened on a random winter afternoon. Virginia was just playing the piano, laughing, singing, and then she coughed. A bright drop of blood bloomed right on her lips. It was the unmistakable, horrific sign of tuberculosis, the exact same disease that had stolen his mother, his foster mother, and his brother, had now come back to suffocate the absolute only light he had left in the world. As Poe sat by her bedside, watching her life slowly fade away, his writing reached this absolute fever pitch of desperation. His stories became incredibly suffocating. In 1843, he writes The Telltale Heart, driven mad by guilt, directly mirroring the pounding pulse in his own ears. He writes The Pit and the Pendulum, a claustrophobic descent into pure terror. And then in 1845, The Raven. He was quite literally bleeding his profound grief onto the page, grappling with the unspeakable cruelty of knowing death is coming and being completely powerless to stop it. So the absolutely crucial point here is that in The Raven, the word nevermore isn't just some catchy refrain in a fictional poem. For Poe, it was a crushing reality. It was a prophecy and a verdict. Nevermore was the grand truth he had been running from his entire life. The horrible realization that once love, happiness, and sanity are gone, they never returned. Let's move to our final chapter to see how this all builds his legacy. Section 6, God of the Gothic. When Virginia finally died in 1847, something inside Poe just broke entirely. He descended into a complete darkness from which he would never, ever recover. He lost his grip on reality. Then, in October 1849, the mystery of his final days unfolds. He just vanished, only to be found wandering a Baltimore park in a state of sheer delirium, wearing clothes that weren't even his own, completely unable to explain how he got there. He died 4 days later in the hospital at just 40 years old. But though his life ended in mystery and unimaginable despair, his words absolutely refused to die. Like H.P. Lovecraft called him, he became the God of the Gothic. Poe laid the absolute blueprint for modern horror and psychological thrillers. He completely reshaped literature by forcefully dragging horror out of the graveyard and planting it directly into the human mind. He showed us that there's a strange beauty even within the horror of loss, because that loss proves that a sweet life actually existed in the first place. Which leaves us with this final, lingering thought. Poe's tragic life really forces us to ask, are the most terrifying monsters the ones hiding in the shadows outside, or the thoughts we simply cannot silence in our own minds? Edgar Allan Poe lived his entire life fighting the latter, and in doing so, he left us with a dark, deeply beautiful truth that will echo forevermore. Thanks so much for joining me for this explanation. I really hope it helped illuminate the brilliant, shadowed mind of Edgar Allan Poe.